Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, John Silvis in conversation with artist Eduardo Crespo. We're going to jump right in tonight, but I want to point out a couple of things so that we can make this the most interesting and engaging conversation as possible. You'll notice in the bottom of the screen, there is a tab Q&A throughout the talk. If questions come to mind, please use Q&A and submit your questions. And after a roughly an hour-long conversation between Eduardo and John, we will then start a Q&A session approximately 7:30 or so. So please use the Q&A button to submit your questions. So without further ado, Eduardo Crespo, across a variety of media, has spent his artistic life examining cultural and historical narratives surrounding different forms of psychological and bodily being. John Silvis is a New York-based curator and art advisor. Silvis' recent artistic research has included artists from Berlin, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore. In addition to curating contemporary art in New York and Los Angeles, he writes for Artsy, CNN, and Parnas. Please give a welcome, though they cannot hear you, to Eduardo Crespo and John Silvis.
Great. Thank you, Paul, so much for that introduction. And it's such a privilege to be able to talk with you, Eduardo, today about your work and your incredible contribution to the art scene. One of the aspects I've enjoyed about your work is just how very personal it is. You also address really poignant issues that we're dealing with as a culture. And aesthetically, I really like the way that your hand is absent in making these beautiful digital drawings and settings for the work. So I find those all very compelling. To begin our talk, I wanted to situate your work in the show, in the Body Electric exhibition. The title of the work from 2015 is Parabiosis 2.2, Neurolibidinal Induction Complex. And when you made that work, you were identifying as Andrea Crespo, and you were also in the process of transitioning, and the work specifically deals with not only your personal experience of that, but then also what's happening around you in sort of this mediated culture, which includes media and then very specific visual websites, visually driven websites that talk about these issues. Now, fast forward 4 years later, you're in the process of detransitioning, and you now go by Eduardo Crespo. And so I thought it'd be really fitting to talk about your series Step Right Up from 2019, because it's a turning point, or like one of the steps in your journey. I think when I think of your work, there is always this sense of journey and exploration, and wanting to kind of really look very seriously at large existential questions. So you've taken your digital drawings and you've printed them on cotton and then stretched them in these very delicate light wood frames, which I think are aesthetically really engaging and kind of remind me of media and how we look at multiple images on screen. So I was curious if you could talk a little bit about this body of work and why this was an important sort of transitional piece in your oeuvre.
So I would say this was an important work, and for me, simply because it tied together a lot of different elements that I had been curious about, and just kind of a lot of disparate threads. It was, in a lot of sense, it's my least personal body of work, but in a lot of ways, it's still tied to. So it's not tied to personal experience in a very direct way, but it's something that I think I wanted to address for a few reasons. One of them being that when I was transgender, it was also kind of at the peak of the trans movement in the middle of the decade. So I was paying a lot of attention to how images of trans people were being mediated, and also the history of that, in a longer scope. I had also been looking, I had also made work about autism and other kinds of bodily difference in some ways that ended up falling under the same kind of lens. And then that's when I realized there was kind of like a common denominator here in terms of how we were looking at these forms of difference, particularly within the tradition of what used to be called the freak show, but then became something different through edutainment, inspirational media, internet memes. I mean, it exists as an echo of the 19th century. And I read a ton of books. I mean, not a ton, but I read a bit of things by people within the field of disability studies and disability theory. But it was interesting because a lot of what I guess the texts were mostly written like in the 90s, and like a lot has changed since the 90s. I mean, when in the 90s, trans people were mostly visible, like, in talk shows rather than in the ways that they're visible now. So this work really kind of started as a reflection of what is going on and has been going on within the last 2 decades, 3 decades or so.
So you feel like also the way that the media has represented trans people has changed over the last 20 years. And if that's true, how do you feel that the representation has changed?
I think that it's changed in the sense that it's less. I mean, there's still a spectacularization of it, but I think that there's also a political element to it that did not exist in the same way before. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes it so that it's not so much about the novelty as much as like narratives and how they relate to broader changes in society. It's less individualized as a kind of curiosity. And there still is that voyeuristic aspect of it, but it's kind of switched into a more political spreading of the phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, even for myself as a curator on a personal level, I've been finding that trans artists are very much integrated into the art world more than 5-6 years ago. So I'm, more, I would say it's more common for me to do a lot of studio visits. And I think that overall as a culture, we've changed and we're just more aware of the community. And so I think in many ways that's a very sort of, positive development that has taken away this kind of mystique about it. And yet, I find that because everyone's personal story is so different, when the media tries to, or even sometimes the art world tries to put it all in a bubble, it's not so cut and dry because everyone's story and everyone's journey is so different.
Yeah, I think that can happen with any narrative of identity. I mean, I think I would say it's more behind in terms of disability narratives. I think I would say, even though disability rights was in the public as something that's being discussed and went into the institutional reforms and stuff, like it's still in terms of the way it's talked about, I think it's still not up to par with other identitarian discourses in terms of its spread.
And so during the last few years, you've had a spiritual awakening and have been exploring different parts of your growing up, which I believe was involved faith and going to Sunday school. And then you've recently did a series called The Seven Sorrows of Mary from 2020. And those reminded me of my own upbringing in the faith. And I was curious what inspired you to do that series coming from the Step Right Up work that we just saw, which is very different in its aesthetic and also in the kind of historical nature of Mary and what she represents in the Bible.
Sure. I didn't go to Sunday school,
Okay.
but I guess why did I jump into this? I think a lot of it had to do with my reversion to Catholicism, but then also my own just personal struggles. I think that there's ways in which this work comes from a similar place as in a very strange and removed way, the work that I was making like in 2015, and which is in this show. And I think because there's, I mean, not just in terms of its palette and kind of, I mean, definitely in terms of palette, they're close, but I would say that I think for me, I was very drawn to Our Lady of Sorrows for a few reasons, but I think for me, there was something about her loss that drew me in, the loss that she experienced in, in losing Christ to death, really. And that whole process, throughout Christ's life, really. And I think that for me, personally, it made sense because there was something about contemplating those sorrows that just, I don't know how to say it, really drew me in, but I think I've felt a sense of loneliness in my life that I think I felt I could really pour into this work.
Yeah, the images definitely can convey a sense of loss and also a sense of isolation. And I'm sure that's something that at different parts of your journey you can really identify with. I also just aesthetically think they're really powerful, and they both feel real, but then otherworldly at the same time. So I really like that quality.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I will say that there's definitely, for me, I would say part of it is I think in terms of my own personal suffering, like I think that my experience of suffering has been less out in the material world, or less I guess kind of like bodily, but then I mean, still experience within the body, but more what we would call within the realm of psychology. So I think that because of that, it's almost like my way to the cross through Mary it's really routed in a sense through, in a lot of ways, through her sorrow, which is how it's how she suffered and participated in the cross. It was more of an emotional, psychological sort of suffering that she experienced, whereas Christ experienced really, I mean, not that there wasn't psychological component. There definitely was, but the spectrum, I think, was a little broader.
Yeah, well, and in your journey, it's been both of those, right? There's been the physical struggle as well as then the sort of psychological of finding authenticity and kind of finding your own identity along the way.
Yeah. I guess so. I guess I guess when I said it's different from the crosses is I literally haven't experienced like really bad injury,
Sure.
and a bodily injury in that sense, or illness. But yeah, certainly even what you experience psychologically, especially when you deal with gender dysphoria, is like you feel it in your body. It feels physical, even if it's in a sense happening neurologically.
Yeah, I don't know that I've heard a lot of people talk about it quite so directly as you do. I mean, one of the things that I enjoy talking with you about art is that you're also very, direct and personal about the journey itself. And I think particularly in your most recent animation transitions from 2021, that you really kind of capture key points in your journey. And I think that struggle is very real. And I think that even though it's kind of in this animated form, there is such emotional intensity. And it actually, when I looked at it and knowing your work and knowing you as an artist, I really felt like I could relate even more to this journey that you're on, and then this movement of, reconnecting with your faith, detransitioning and kind of living as a man, and what that means to you. And so I felt like this video is very, very poignant. For our discussion, I thought it would be interesting if we watch a segment of it and then continue talking about what this piece means to you. So that was just a one minute segment from your animation. It's quite intense, and I also really was creeped out a little bit by the soundtrack, I have to admit. So I'd like to hear you talk about what you feel when you're kind of thinking about this piece, when you're watching it, and maybe even some of the technical decisions with the animation and the sound.
Sure. Firstly, I want to say that it's on my website. It's on YouTube. You can watch it, on at home. So if anyone wants to check it out, they can do that. The second thing is that I guess for me it was really motivated by me wanting to put a narrative out there to tell my story and put a narrative out there that without being overly long, and perhaps like that it would counter, I guess, a lot of what's out there in terms of trans narratives and the way that things are being talked about and discussed. And I think that that was my main impulse, and hoping that it would help other people.
How do you feel like your relationship to the trans community is now that you're in this phase of detransitioning? Has it changed? Are you viewing it different than you did 2 years ago?
It definitely has. I think that I'm not very connected with the trans community, but I do have, there are trans people that I guess have contact with. Or trans identified people, not too closely. But it's still present in my life. I keep up with a lot of what's going on. But I definitely don't directly engage in the trans community in the way that I used to. And not that I think that the word community is a strange word that we kind of use in discourse. Like, it's like this community, that community, and it makes it seem like something a little different than what it is. I think a lot of it exists more as social networks. Not that people don't form real bonds and stuff, but I think that when you hear this kind of like monolithic trans community, it sounds so organized and like, but it's not like that. It's a little more of a network. It's a little more sparse, I think.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's extremely diverse also in terms of maybe different smaller networks within a larger network.
Yes, definitely.
And so in terms of this peace transition, there's also a spiritual element that you address, and I'm curious how faith has kind of played or woven its way throughout the last 5 or 6 years of your life.
That's a very complicated matter, but I think that I can start to say that in a lot of ways, a lot of the questions I was asking, a lot of my desires and all these things were pointing towards that, but I think that they were misdirected, and I think that in a sense I went so far in certain ways that I think I realized I found my way back to the church, and I think and I can't take credit for that, because that I think involves providence, but and grace, but I think that it was all related. All these, it wasn't. I think that in a lot of ways, what seems like a movement away was actually a movement towards God, even if it was kind of in opposition to God for some time.
Mm-hmm. So you felt like you were somehow disconnected from God at one point, and now you're moving towards a different connection.
Yes. I didn't. I wouldn't say that I was not a practicing Catholic like up until really 2018, and before that, I had gone through phases of New Agey type spiritual vague beliefs, and as well as atheism. I mean, I've more pagan beliefs, but I guess that I think one thing is there's it's not that I had this crystallized in my mind early on, but it's something that, based off a discussion with the priest who's a friend, Father Paul, and who introduced us, but he was talking about how the trans community asks one of the main, a very important question, and it's like, who are we? Like, who am I? And that's I think, in a sense, like in my asking that question, like it led me to this point, even though I attempted to answer it in very different ways prior to my reversion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, surrounding this question that we're talking about today in relation to your work, identity politics, there's these two elements. On one hand, there's the kind of personal identity. On the other hand, then there's this kind of political component. How do you feel like sort of media and images impacted you or your work, and how do you feel about it then and now?
I think that in a lot of ways I made sense of the world through the images that I consumed, growing up. I think a lot of us do. And I think that, there are more common ways of doing that. And then there are more, I guess, atypical ways of that happening. I think that everyone identifies with something that they see, and the things they see, the narratives they get. I think that, when someone's trans, then it's or experiences gender discord, feelings of gender discord, then it's a matter of maybe identifying with people or images of people that are not of your sex. So and I think that can go beyond that. People, I think part of what my old work was kind of really exploring more of, and what's in this show is really that it wasn't just trans. Like, there were more aspects to it, more sides to it. It was like I had different ideas of my body, or how I felt my body should be, than in ways that were kind of like outlandish to in a even within the current cultural climate. But I think that a lot of, how do I say this? I think that for me, it was almost experiencing this extreme of that led me to this sort of awakening, or I think if I had a more typical experience, I might have not questioned some of the things I ended up questioning. But I don't know. That's something that I can't know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that always interests me with an artist is what their visual influences are. We were talking a lot about the media, but I'm also curious about your artistic influences, the artists that you admired along the way.
I think it depends. I mean, through different points in my life, I've taken the style, I guess, adopted or internalized different styles. I mean, I think I've underplayed like the influence of Giacometti, but in transitions, you kind of see a little Giacometti in these kind of scribble forms. I think Baroque art has influenced me. I think that iconography Christian iconography has influenced me. And a lot of these things are unconscious, or just things that I wasn't really too consciously thinking of. I think that, yeah, those are, I guess, a few influences, but also there's stuff that I've just kind of absorbed osmotically from like other things like video games or anime, well, back then, I guess, but like just popular culture, and so that's kind of, I guess, part of where it comes from.
And where do you see your work going now? That there's been sort of quite a shift now in your direction. Do you have a sense of what the next body of work will be?
I mean, well, there's like a video that I finished actually, and it's going to be released soon. So it's not like in the future as something I'm working on, but it's as something that the public will see. So, and I am revisiting the topic of school shooters, which I had previously addressed in relation to discussions around autism and mental illness. So that's something that I am readdressing, but with a more spiritual dimension, because I think that's a often neglected part within the discourse. And then in terms of other work, there is other stuff I'm working on, but I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about it. So I'll leave it at that.
So the piece that you were talking about, the schools, and you said the shooting, right? School shooting.
School shooters.
School
overall,
shooting. That's going to be a film or an animation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that'll be, I guess, the soonest thing.
Okay. Any other thoughts you want to share with us, or aspects of the work that we didn't cover that we should talk about? Not really. Well, it was great to delve more into your work. I think there's a lot of complexity there, and again, I think one of the really interesting things about your work is how you're able to walk that line of both being personal, but then also addressing these larger cultural issues and how the media plays into that. I think really every aspect of your work talks about that, and the work is very poignant in that way. Thank you.
I might as well jump back in. And we do have a question here.
Okay.
Was there a specific moment you realized you needed to or wanted to detransition?
Yes. I mean, there were moments. I think that a lot of these things happen gradually. I will say that there was one specific instance in which, and this is in my recent video, in which I was in a church. It was I was not practicing as a Catholic, but I was walking across the Manhattan Bridge. I was having a bad time, and then the bridge on the Brooklyn side, it's right in front of the Cathedral Basilica of St. James. And I walked in, and I just broke down, and I looked at an image of Mary in the stained glass, and I don't know why, but it was a moment in which I thought, I'm not a woman. like it was like just like that moment in which that felt very clear to me. Even though I had seen images of women and interacted with women, there was something about that moment and that image at that moment, and something that happened through that image that I think was a pivotal moment. Now, of course, the detransition happened gradually. Even there was time even when I was still going by Andrea, but not taking hormones. So that was a gradual process. There's other aspects to it, but I'm not going to get into them.
Okay. Got another one here. What is your hope for the merger of the art world with the spiritual aspect? I'm assuming that spiritual aspect of your life. Spiritual aspect in a grand macro sense also.
Well, I think that's something I'm still working out. I think that it's hard right now, because I think that there have been some forays into spirituality in art, but they are they're very politicized, and kind of like subservient to another, like a more contemporary narrative. So, and then secondly, I think that a lot of people unfortunately have an issue with Christianity. So I think that that's something that I feel I've felt a lot of friction. With that said, I think that I hope that my work can speak to people regardless, and that they will hopefully, set aside biases that they might have, and approach it with openness. And yeah.
Your work seems to have a universal appeal. How do you find different people react? Do you have favorite or opposed feelings or ideas that you want people to take away?
I find, I guess, how do I find different people? Some people, how do I find that they react? Depends what there is. What you're talking about and what point in time, because as the work has changed, the reactions have changed. I think some people get really happy when they see some of my recent work. I think some people get kind of weirded out, like they don't know what to do, or they're kind of, or they'll say something like, "Oh, well, about how it's formally good," but they have issues with the religious content. With my older work, it was kind of a lot of, I think there was a kind of like novelty thing that like people were really like into, like, whoa, what is this? What's going on? Like, I think I was, whereas there was also kind of this like, in another way, a different kind of flattening that sometimes happened because of the trans moment. And they were like, "Oh, you're a trans artist and it's 2015." So I don't know. That kind of thing also happened. In terms of what my favorite feelings or ideas that people take away, I want them to feel that someone is present to them and that they're not alone, and that this work is not about, it's not just for any specific person or group. That like the person who asked this question said, that it has a universal appeal, and I hope it does. I know it fails sometimes, but I think that universality, as much as that's been deconstructed and opposed within the last half a century, I guess, almost, I think that there is such a thing as universality.
Okay. Do you still think there is freedom in breaking out of identity categories, or do you think freedom comes regardless of identity categories from within?
So let me think about that. Do you think? I think that freedom consists in our choices and what we do, and our actions, and how we respond to the reality that we're given, and how do we respond to everything we're given. So I think that identity in itself, these identity categories aren't just. I think it's an error to think that our identity comes from our inclinations, our desires, even ways that we live our lives. I think that ultimately, and this is what I've realized in my faith, is like my identity comes from relationship with God, and that in itself is very different from how I used to view things, because I used to view things as more about like these kind of categories, but it's not about categories or categorization or I like this, I like that, I present myself this way or don't present myself that way. It's really founded on a relationship in which I can freely respond and act for or against. So that's how I see it, and that's where I see freedom lies. I think that identity categories, I mean, I'm not saying that they're completely irrelevant, but I think in the United States, we've built up especially all these kind of forms of identity, and it's like, whether it's white identity or trans identity or there's all these kind of different identities, whether on the left wing or right wing, and it hasn't done anything to create real unity, and I don't think it's given anyone peace really. I think it's useful to say, well, I have this in common with this person, and I've suffered through this just like this person. Something, this is a real problem. Like that's I think makes sense, but I also think that like we are making idols out of these identity categories, and ultimately it's I think taking away part of our humanity.
Interesting. Following up on the point you just made about identity and previously about universality, I'm curious, and I just want to say, listening to you respond to John's questions, I was reminded of, what was it that Socrates said? The unexamined life isn't worth living. And you've just been examining life on and on, over and over again. And I want to commend you for that. And it leads me to ask something that came to mind. You go through transition and then detransition, and nominally speaking, that represents a movement from cisgendered, not identity, cisgendered subjectivity to transgendered subjectivity. But something suggests to me that in your detransition, that you've arrived potentially at something other than cisgender. Am I correct? It's almost, I feel as though your journey could potentially illuminate some things that most of us never even consider. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Or I guess I could pose it as a question. Have you de-transitioned back to cisgender? Or do you feel like where you've arrived in your life is an integration of all of the different experiences that you've had?
I think that, I mean, I don't, I mean, I think that there are trans-identified people and people who are transitioning or living in ways that put them in proximity with trans identity. But I don't believe that there's a cisgender and transgender subjectivity. I think that there are certain subjective things that are common to the people that we are calling cisgender and the people that we are calling transgender, even though there's sometimes overlap and, or frictions within there. And I think that for me, it definitely doesn't feel like I transitioned to the person I was before I transitioned. I think it is a movement forward. And I think that it's really, again, about realizing the basis of identity. Like, I think before it was like about being a man and what that meant, and like all the other things that I thought that meant, and my ideas of being a man. And then it became about my ideas of being a woman. And then now it's like, well, I acknowledge the biological reality of my male sex, but at the same time, I see that that is not the entire basis of my identity, and that it's my identity comes from something more.
Okay. John, any thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I like that question that you asked, Paul. I think that it's important to look at the whole scope of your work and your journey, and I really admire how specific and what kind of difficult questions you're asking, because I think the average person doesn't delve into it that deeply and maybe just accepts the things that are kind of thrown at us or that we're absorbing in the media, in culture, but we don't maybe think about them on this kind of existential level. So I really like that your work makes me think about that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think when you experience, it's like, in the same way that there's certain things that we don't notice them while they work, but only when there's some kind of error or discord within them, it's like that, then it's like, oh, it's not working, and we take it for granted. I think that a lot of the ways that we think about ourselves and who we are, it doesn't become a question. It is a question, but it doesn't really become a question to a lot of people until there's some kind of misfire or error or difference that is hard to really assimilate within a worldview. And that's part of why with that work, Step Right Up, I got into that, was not to ask those questions. Well, I guess to ask those questions a bit, but also look at how we ask those questions. Because the thing is, like, really, it's a lot of people looking at what it's a lot of people are thinking about the trans thing, and they're a tiny percentage of the population. So it's like, what is it to everyone else? You know what I mean? And why? And that's what Step Right Up kind of addresses. It's like, why are there television shows of people with disabilities just living their lives? Like, what is that to everyone? Why do we do that? And it's, of course, not exploitative in the way that it used to be in the 19th century, but it's still like, why are we doing that? Like what, you know, and I think that in a sense, like, I mean, there's obviously like carnal motivations and curiosity and emotional stuff, but I think part of it is it probably brings to question, what is the person, what does the person mean, you know, because if someone doesn't have a certain quality that you assume people have, then it's like that messes with our schema, so to say, of what a person is.
And so do you feel personally that you've moved beyond that, let's call it a trap?
I don't think I've moved on completely. I think that trap is always there. That temptation is always there to even identify with your profession, your career, what you do, you know, your race, your gender, like all these things are always there constantly. You know, and there's material circumstances, you know, like, and it's like, because the thing is like, even, okay, I don't want to be seen as this, but people are going to see you that way and they're going to treat you a certain way. And that can make you, you know, it's like, for example, as someone who's gone from very far left to becoming a conservative Catholic, it's like there's this kind of temptation of like, oh, well, now I'm on the far right, I'm like a traditionalist, and it's like, no, it's the same exact trap that I, you know, of that I was falling into before, and it's kind of like, what does it mean to be Catholic? And you know, back to the word universal, the word Catholic means universal. So it's not about being a Republican who votes a certain way and like thinks in a very rigid way. Like, I think that's a misunderstanding that people have about tradition, that it's like mindless copying, but it's not. And I think that you know, with that said, there's still respect for tradition and dogma and adherence to that, but there's still, I think, for me, it's like, it's been interesting that I've also like realized like, oh, like I had, like, not only did I have weird assumptions about myself and who I am, I had weird assumptions about who other people are, whether they're on my team or the other team. And I think, you know, again, that's what takes away our humanity, because it's like, oh, the poor people, the rich people, the religious people, the gay people, like it becomes this kind of like thing that I think robs us of again, our humanity and our ability to form common bonds and to love each other.
And do you see yourself working through the question of that common bond, common humanity in your creative work?
Possibly.
And do you sense, or how do I put it? Do you imagine or hope that there's a degree of original messaging taking place in your work, that upon seeing it, or in many of your works, seeing and hearing it, a viewer could potentially stumble upon an insight, or maybe just a clue to the possibility of a certain notion or kind of freedom from identity constraints? Because, in other words, your struggle is certainly, your journey has certainly been involved a series of eclipses. And I wonder if you are at all in your work trying to propose to people value in such a process.
What do you mean by eclipses?
Well, you know, the stage transitioning, detransitioning. You said you had a moment of atheism, New Ageism, rejected Catholicism. You've returned to it. There's a lot of thought that has gone, and feeling, no doubt, that has gone on for you personally and your potentially your family and community, your friends, as well as your artwork. Clearly, you've marked various stages in that journey through your art, and I just wondered to what extent your art functions as a kind of theoretical space where you're working through ideas through your art. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I feel like I mean, I've been doing that through my work, and I think that, you know, I think people, my audience has accompanied me through that. And I think, you know, they've accompanied me through errors as much as they've accompanied me through moments of insight and enlightenment. So I think it is a process, and it's something that I can't create. I can't make the solution. Like, I don't think I'm going to work something out in my work that is the true answer. I think that the best that I can do is I can get at the truth and lead people to it in a way that is appropriate to this age.
Mm-hmm. Okay. John, any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I think that's a great statement. I mean, I think that your work is really talking to where we are right now, and I think you know, this really polarization that's been in culture the last few years has really brought out the need, right, for something different. That all of these categories don't really work, right, because we're all more than just one category. And so I think your work definitely points to that, or, you know, maybe provides an alternative moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
I hope so.
So in that way, I think, you know, the work is doing something really important.
Thanks.
I agree. Well, it looks like people are jumping ship. So maybe we want to, do you have any other comments or questions, John?
I'm set for now.
Okay,
I think we covered the essence of his work. And
Eduardo, do you have anything more you want to add?
Someone just asked another question.
Oh, we got one. Okay. Could you talk about the integration of artistic talent and IT technology? You seem to be making a living in that. Congratulations.
Thank you. I guess that they're not as incompatible as maybe a lot of people think they are. I think that you know, the artists, I think especially before modernity or very early modernity, learned a lot more things that would be within the technical realm. I mean, if you see or you know, scientific technical realms, and I think that I think people have like a more in the more contemporary view, it's like, oh, there's like artsy creative people, and then there's like the people in STEM who run Amazon or whatever, and like I think that those are false distinctions. I think you know, even if an artist isn't using digital media, there's always some kind of material aspect that involves technical knowledge. For the most part, you know, even if it's super conceptual artwork and language, like it's like, well, you gotta use a computer to type it out or something. I mean, of course, there's different degrees of it, but there's always some kind of interface with reality, which means that there's going to be some kind of very often technical mediation of that. It's not always true. I mean, especially with performance art, but even then the documentation, recording all requires that. And I think that there are different kinds of thinking, and some people really don't, you know, can't wrap their heads around the technology, and that's fine. And then there are people who are more technically oriented, and that's good that they can do that with their work, and that there's interfacing between those different disciplines, because that's you know, the siloing of different disciplines and majors and all that stuff, that's like a relatively recent development in Western history. You know, before people, it was like expected that you kind of learned a little more of everything, and then specialized.
Okay. It looks like our questions have come to an end. I would like to thank both of you for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, John. And I wish you both the best of luck and fortune moving ahead. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in to tonight's program. And we look forward to you engaging MOAD in the future. On that note, take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.